What happens when you give a society everything it needs to survive, but yet that society still falls apart? They have food, water, shelter, protection from predators, and many dangers. Everything physically needed to survive is available. You would expect that population to thrive, right? But not necessarily. The population grew, behavior changed, aggression appeared, some withdrew, the parenting shifted, reproduction stopped, and eventually the population disappeared. And here's what makes the story I'm about to discuss so fascinating. This wasn't a human society, they were mice. And the experiment became known as Universe 25. One of the biggest things I want people to understand about this experiment was they didn't run out of food, water. So, what exactly was going on? Was it the space? Was it social structure, the way they were interacting with each other? Was it because some of the mice couldn't establish a role? That's where Universe 25 becomes deeper than just saying that it was overcrowded. Before we go any further, let's talk about some of the work of the researcher, John B. Calhoun. More than 50 years later, people are still debating what happened inside that enclosure and what, if anything, it can tell us about ourselves as humans. Calhoun published his findings in 1973 in Death Squared. So let's get into it. Today, Blue Crew, we're going down a rabbit hole. Well, technically a mouse hole. No, but seriously, Universe 25 is not just mice got everything, they went crazy and proved humans are doomed. No, the real story is much more complicated and much more interesting. Before Universe 25, John Calhoun has spent years studying animal populations, social behavior, population growth, and environment. He was an American researcher whose work eventually brought him to the National Institute of Mental Health, where Universe 25 was constructed. The National Library of Medicine preserved his papers, his photographs, and filmed as of today. Universe 25 was not his first experiment. It was part of a larger series that was focused on territory, social groups, and population growth, mating, parenting, aggression, and social roles. His earlier work also produced a phrase closely tied to his name, the behavior sink, describing severe disruption in normal behavior under certain crowded social conditions. His 1962 Scientific American article that was called Population Density and Social Pathology helped bring those ideas wider attention. By the time Universe 25 began, Calhoun was continuing a larger investigation into one question: how much can environment shape the way we behave toward each other? Universe 25 was built, as stated earlier, at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And according to the National Library of Medicine materials, the enclosure was roughly 9 feet by 9 feet with 5-foot high metal walls. And that was divided for nesting and movement. So Calhoun removed many ordinary threats. No predators, food and water were provided, and nesting areas were definitely available. And that is why people often call it the mouse utopia, though that phrase can be a little misleading because when you think utopia, that sounds like luxury, but this experiment was more about population space and social behavior after many survival limits had been removed. So the original Universe 25 population began with this very small group of mice, and over time the population expanded dramatically. So Calhoun later documented the rise and decline in his 1973 scientific paper. At first, things looked really successful. The mice reproduced and the population increased, and the enclosure may have seemed to be working. But then something changed. Now, I think with this experiment, there were 8 mice. I think it was 4 males and 4 females. Look at where this eventually went. Like, that's what fascinates me. Something can start very small, and as the population grows and environment change, the whole social dynamic can change with it. So Calhoun wasn't just watching that population number go up, he was watching what happened to the behavior of the population as it grew. And also, something I learned by researching this episode is that the internet version usually goes too many mice equals collapse. But the actual scientific conversation is much more complicated than that because Calhoun was interested in how much and how the space was organized. He was interested in how often the mice were forced into interactions, whether they could establish social roles, whether they had a place within their environment. So when somebody says that Universe 25 simply proved that overcrowding destroys society, that's a little bit too simple. And that becomes even more important when we start looking at how the mice actually behaved. So let's talk about what started to happen. As the population developed, Calhoun observed serious behavior changes like disrupted social interactions, more aggression, disturbed mating and parenting patterns, difficulty establishing social roles, and even withdrawal and eventually failed reproduction. And that is what made Universe 25 famous. The collapse was not simply about running out of food. Physical resources remained available while the population's social world unraveled. Then came the most famous animals in the experiment, the beautiful ones. If you've learned or if you heard about Universe 25, you've probably heard that phrase before, the beautiful ones. In later stages, Calhoun identified mice that looked cleaner and less scarred than others. They groomed often but avoided many complex adult behaviors tied to competition, mating, and reproduction. So, the National Library of Medicine materials describe them as animals that avoided difficult social contact and failed to develop some adult behaviors needed to sustain the population. Now, this is where I completely understand why people's minds started making comparison to humans because you're looking at something that appeared fine on the outside, clean, well grown, physically okay, but socially something is missing, and immediately your mind starts to connect the dots. But this is something I want us to remember throughout this episode. An analogy can make us think without becoming scientific proof. So something looking familiar doesn't automatically mean it happened for the same reason. And that extension is going to matter a lot when we start comparing Universe 25 with humans. So let's elaborate on why Universe 25 became so famous. The timing matters. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, people were anxious about population growth, crowded cities, limited resources, the environment, and whether Earth could sustain continued expansion. Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb came out in 1968, and public conversations about overpopulation were everywhere. Historians at the National Library of Medicine have specifically connected Calhoun's cultural impact with those fears about population growth and the future of human society. So imagine hearing about Universe 25 at that time, an enclosed population, supply resources, rapid growth, behavioral decline, failed reproduction, and disappearance. It sounded almost like a warning about civilization or something. Calhoun and his experiments were also filmed, which gave television and educational film audiences a direct look at the enclosure. The mice and the scientists explaining what had happened. NLM still preserves footage of Universe 25 and Calhoun's work. If Universe 25 happened for the first time today, social media will lose its mind. I mean, the YouTube title will probably be something like Scientists Created a Perfect Society and Everyone Died. But that viral version is exactly the problem. It's usually much simpler than the science. So, did this make John Calhoun one of the most famous scientists? Not exactly. John B. Calhoun was not Albert Einstein famous, and his name never became universally recognizable. But he was influential within his field, and the Universe 25 became the experiment most strongly associated with him. Modern scientific literature still describes it as his most famous experiment. Maybe you didn't know Calhoun's name before today, but there's a good chance you've heard some version of his experiment. More than 50 years later, we're still discussing it, and that is a significant scientific legacy. Now, some of you may be asking, but why mice? This was one of my first questions. If scientists are asking questions that might relate to humans, then why use mice? Scientists use model organisms, and mice are especially useful because they are mammals, share many biological and physiological features with humans, are practical to maintain in research settings, and reproduce quickly enough for researchers to observe several generations. The National Human Genome Research Institute describes the mouse as a premier mammalian model system for research. They also allow researchers to control variables like food, housing, environment, genetics, population, and living conditions. Questions that would be extremely difficult or impossible to test experimentally in people. But there is a major warning: mice are not like humans. Humans and mice share important biological similarities, but they are also major differences. Mouse research can generate hypotheses and teach us about biological systems, but findings in mice do not automatically translate directly to humans. Let's be clear. That matters for Universe 25 because moving from this happened to mice to this is exactly what's happening to humanity is a huge leap. And because you couldn't ethically recreate Universe 25 with human beings, researchers do study people through clinical trials, psychological studies, surveys, interviews, observational research, and population studies. But modern human subject research requires strict ethical protections. Under U.S. human research rules, institutional review, informed consents, and participant protections are fundamental requirements in covered studies. HHS also emphasizes that people should be able to voluntarily decide whether to participate and generally whether to continue. Now imagine trying to recreate Universe 25 with people. Researchers place hundreds or eventually thousands of people in a controlled environment, manipulate the conditions, and then watch as psychological distress, violence, family breakdown, or harm develops. If participants wanted to leave and scientists said, no, we need to see what happens to the fifth generation, that would be totally unacceptable. Scientists can observe human populations, study existing environments, and conduct ethical experiments. But deliberately creating prolonged harmful conditions just to watch a society deteriorate is different. And that is one of the major reasons why animal models have historically been used for questions that cannot ethically be tested the same way with people. Now, we're at the controversial part, the place where people start looking at Universe 25 and saying, wait, does any of this sound familiar? I want to stop here because this may be the most important distinction in the whole episode. Like, we can see similarities, we ask questions, but a similarity does not automatically mean the cause is the same, right? So, a mouse withdrawing from its colony and a person withdrawing from society may look similar from a distance, but human beings have culture, economics, family history, religion, mental health, trauma, technology, laws, personal choices, things these mice may never have to deal with. So don't leave this episode saying Blue Baby said we're becoming mice. No, that's not what Blue Baby said. I'm asking whether some of the patterns Calhoun observed raise interesting questions about us. And once we make that distinction, I think the human comparison actually becomes much more useful. Calhoun was deeply interested in social organization, which animals had roles which dominated, reproduced, parented, or withdrew. Human beings have social roles too: parent, child, friend, spouse, employees, teacher, leader, caregiver, neighbor, mentor, and community member. That raises a human question. What happens when someone feels there isn't a meaningful role for them anymore? Like when they feel that they don't feel like they're useful, connected, or able to contribute. That doesn't mean that they're behaving like Calhoun's mice, but it explains why questions about social structure still matters. Some animals in Calhoun's population withdrew from complicated social interactions. When we look at human society, we can ask similar questions about disengagement. What happens when people stop participating in communities, relationships, institution, family structures, civic life, and traditional roles? This is where I could take us down a completely different road, because once we start talking about withdrawing connection, now we're getting into relationships like loneliness, social media, mental health, family, and what it feels like to be surrounded by people while still feeling disconnected. Now, another obvious comparison is reproduction. Universe 25 eventually failed to sustain it. And people sometimes look at modern changes in human birth rates and immediately say, see, it's Universe 25. Hold on. Human beings make decisions about children based on factors mice aren't even considering: housing, money, relationships, marriage, career, education, health, childcare, contraception, cultural, and personal choice. A mouse isn't sitting in Universe 25 looking at daycare prices saying, well, I don't know if we can afford another one. So, yes, reproduction declined in the mouse population, and some human societies also experience decline in fertility. But similar outcomes don't prove identical causes. And that's where we separate an interesting comparison from a scientific conclusion. Calhoun also documented serious disruptions involving aggression and social conflict in his rodent populations. Humans experience aggression and conflict too, but our causes are much more complicated, like politics, economics, history, trauma, culture, psychology, inequality, crime, war, relationships. So human conflict can't be reduced to Calhoun's mice fought, and people fight too. That's not useful. How much can environments increase or decrease the stress placed on social relationships? That is the more useful question, and it's worth studying. This may be the comparison I find most interesting. The mice had access to physical resources, yet the social system did not remain healthy. That does not prove that comfort destroys civilizations or that wealth makes people dysfunctional, but it does challenge one simple assumption, and that's if a population has enough material resources, everything else will automatically work itself out. Human societies absolutely need physical resources. We need food, housing, safety, and healthcare. All of that matter. But functioning societies also depend on less tangible foundations: trust, meaning, responsibility, corporation, family structures, institution, purpose, and belonging, and the sense that participation matters. Maybe that's why people keep seeing themselves in Universe 25. It reminds us that survival resources are not the same as a healthy social system. Here's the part that I think gets ignored when people use Universe 25 as a prediction of human doom. Humans can analyze what is happening to us. The mice could not redesign the enclosure, create new systems, organize a community, develop support services, or study past generations and decide to behave differently, but we can. We can look at an unhealthy system and say, this isn't working. We can change institutions, the laws, traditions, individual behaviors, and the systems we live inside. Human beings are not simply reacting to an enclosure. we are actively shaping our environments too. That is an enormous difference. This is a perfect place to clear up some of the internet mythology around Universe 25. Calhoun did not prove that human civilization is doomed, that comfort collapses society, that crowded cities make people behave like his mice, that he predicted social media, or that decline in human birth rates share the same cause as Universe 25. What he did conduct was a real experiment in which a mouse population experienced dramatic changes in social behavior, reproduction, and population dynamics. And those two things are very different. There is the experiment Calhoun conducted, and then there are decades of interpretation layered on top of that. We shouldn't confuse the two. That's why modern researchers don't treat Universe 25 as prophecy. They treat it as a question worth revisiting. In 2026, researchers Thomas Guzdala and Yukub Dust published the Calhoun experiment study by means of agent-based modeling in the journal Entropy. Instead of creating another physical Universe 25, they used an agent-based computer modeling to try to reproduce aspects of the population's dynamics Calhoun observed. In simple terms, they asked whether simulated individuals, given certain behaviors and rules, could interact in ways that produce larger population patterns similar to Calhoun's findings. That's what science is supposed to do, like revisit ideas and test them, model them, question them, and look for better explanations. And modern researchers continue to discuss uncertainties surrounding exactly what produced the outcome of Universe 25. The fact that researchers are still doing that nearly 60 years after Universe 25 began shows how influential this experiment became. And this is honestly like one of my favorite facts from researching this entire episode. Universe 25 began in 1968, and researchers published new work examining it in 2026. And think about that, like almost 60 years later, and they weren't saying that John Calhoun predicted humanity. That's not what they were doing. They were going back and asking scientific questions like, can we model this? Can we reproduce parts of the population pattern? Like, what information was missing from the original experiment? Could there be other explanations? And that's exactly what good science looks like to me. When we stay with the science side of things, the next thing we have to ask is, how far can we really take the comparison between mice and humans? So why do people keep seeing themselves in these mice? If Universe 25 doesn't predict our future, why do humans keep looking at it and seeing ourselves? People connected to family change, withdrawal from traditional roles, decline in birth rates, appearance culture, social conflict, and the behavior sink. So maybe every generation sees its own fear inside the Universe 25. In late 1960s, that fear was overpopulation. Today, it may be technology, social media, relationships, birth rates, mental health, political division, purpose, disengagement, and community. Maybe 50 years from now, people will look at the exact same mice and see something completely different. Are we learning about the mice, or are we learning about ourselves by noticing which parts of the experiment scares us the most? And that's a question Calhoun mice can't answer for us. Maybe this is where I ultimately land. Human beings need physical resources, food, water, housing, safety, and healthcare, but are those things alone enough? Do people also need meaningful roles, purpose, healthy relationships, privacy, community, responsibility, opportunities to contribute, healthy ways to handle conflict, and a sense that there is a place for them? Universe 25 cannot answer those questions for humans, but we're far too complicated for 8 mice inside an enclosure to explain how civilization works. But the experiment can make us ask better questions, and maybe that's the real value. So let's bring this home. Universe 25 began as a controlled mouse population experiment, but it became famous because it landed in the middle of real human fears about crowding, overpopulation, and the future of society. But after everything we've discussed, I don't think the lesson is humans are becoming mice or we're doomed. That's too simple. The stronger takeaway is that Universe 25 asks us to think carefully about the environments we build and the social systems that we depend on. Instead, it leaves us with a better question. What does a society need in order to truly thrive, not simply survive? Because surviving and thriving are not the same thing. Maybe that is why these mice continue to fascinate us, not because we literally see ourselves inside them, but because the experiment keeps forcing us to ask very human questions, right? If today's episode made you think less about the mice and more about your own relationships, your mental health, social media, family, or whether you're genuinely connected to people around you, as I stated earlier, I want you to go back to episode 6, The Loneliness Nobody Sees, How to Reconnect in a World So Disconnected. Episode 7 asks what Universe 25 can and cannot teach us about society, but episode 6 takes that conversation home. What do we do when we're the ones feeling disconnected? How do we protect our relationships and how we reconnect? How do we make sure technology supports human connection instead of completely replacing it? So when you finish this episode, go back and check that out. Episode 6. Until next time, Blue Crew, take care of your mind, stay curious, keep asking questions, and I'll meet you right back here on Blu Mindz next Tuesday.